Today, for the next 30 minutes, give or take, we're going to be going over a lot of the different techniques and different whys and why nots, and all of the different advice that you hear when you get into curly cutting, why it exists, why it happens, and what the result is. So we're going to start out in her fringe area. We're going to be doing some C cutting. I use this technique for detailing or for entire cuts, and it really just depends which circumstance we're working with. We're going to talk about that today. So when we're deciding how to come in and C cut for detailing, and we're going to be detailing the entire fringe, first and foremost, we're going to make sure that we're using the apex of our shears. The apex of the shear is the most sharp spot. We don't use it often when we're cutting. Usually we're using that top inch or however long those first two knuckles are. And when we're coming in, we want to make sure that we're precise as we go through and move through the hair. That way we minimize damage and we get the most impact for our work. So I'm going to first decide right here in the middle. So right in the middle of her forehead, this is where we're going to start creating our shape for her fringe. And because she already has a fringe, we're just going to be trimming it. So we're going to select a coil that sits at the apex of this fringe, and we're going to isolate it. And then I'm going to come in and I'm going to come into the interior of the curl. So I'm not going to come on the exterior of the curl. I'm going to use the inside of the bend. So when we're detailing and when we're doing these kinds of cuts, it's important that we're paying attention to the inside of the bend. Now, as we come through, we are taking very tiny cuts all the way through the bend. Now, because they are so small, it looks like we are sliding, but we are not slide cutting. We are coming in and rocking our shears quickly with very tiny movements all the way through the bend. What's great about this technique is you get a bunch of tries if you're inclined to come in more hesitantly. So you can come in, just take a little, kind of pop that up, see what happens, and then decide if you want to come in and shape that coil more. As you take weight out of the inside of the coil, you're going to create more shrinkage. So stepping back from your work after every cut and assessing how much shrinkage you're getting with each cut is crucial to getting the final impact that you want. So as you can see here, we're already starting to taper up across that line. And I'm going to keep coming in and just creating the perimeter for the fringe. And then we'll come in and we'll add a little more volume as we go back through. So I do want to start by talking about why we're dry cutting instead of wet cutting. So for this model, she typically wears her hair curly 100% of the time. She doesn't alternate between curly and straight styles. And she wears her hair with a little more definition than she does volume. This means that we have coils that are more pronounced. As we start to separate coils, we get more volume. So keeping that in mind while you're deciding what you're doing with your curly cutting and how you're approaching it is going to make a huge, huge difference. Understanding the relationship when it comes to a finished style between volume and definition is the foundation for how I approach cutting, coloring, and styling when it comes to curls. This is something that I consider in the consultation. How does she wear her hair? Because to be honest with you guys, all of the time I get asked, well, if we're coming in and we're intuitively cutting curls, right? If we're intuitively cutting dry curls, we're going to know that it will look its absolute best when it is worn curly in the style that the client wears it. But if they alternate or deviate from that style, it is not always going to lay the same. And that is something that we have to address with our clients in the consultation, right? These are choices that we make and that we deduce as we're working through that consultation and deciding what techniques and what combination of techniques we want to use. The difference between dry cutting And wet cutting for curls is how much control you have in each setting, right? So if we're using dry cutting, if we're coming in and dry cutting, we have the most control over the finished result because we're accounting for variations in different curl patterns. We're accounting for variations in how the hair lays. This is going to give us the most control to that end goal or the finished product. If we come in and we're wet cutting, we're going to have the most control within sections, but we have a lot more variable because we don't know exactly how different coil patterns, different tightnesses of coils, and different growth patterns are going to lay once it's dry. I am trying something new for this live. So I was trying to see if I could see our live here on the iPad so I can monitor comments. Unfortunately, I don't think that's gonna work out. But after the live, I will come back in and go through comments, at least for the next 24 hours to come in and answer any questions that you have. So I've established the perimeter for this fringe, and now we're gonna come in and we're going to shape along the fringe and kind of round this, because later on another live, we'll be coming in and we'll be tapering in that fringe perimeter with the rest of the cut and tying in where our volume starts based on her curl pattern and how she styles. I'm gonna go in and go ahead and taper this last section. Again, using that apex and coming through and making light, quick movements just with the thumb. We are not sliding, okay? Sliding is going to create more erratic diffusion. It's going to rough up that cuticle layer, possibly create some breakage, which in the end is going to create more unintentional volume in that finished style that our clients having to fight when they're styling at home. So now that we have this perimeter established, I'm gonna take one more here. I'm gonna come in and I'm gonna add a little texture and a little volume. I'm going to do this by coming on the exterior of the hair that we just created this perimeter line for and specifically selecting coils to help take some of the weight off so we get a more rounded shape, all right? Depending on how tight the curl pattern is, the tighter the curl pattern, by just cutting, if you're wet cutting this fringe, by just cutting all of this an equal length, you will still get slight elevation in that finished style the tighter the coil pattern is. She has a medium curl pattern, and so we don't get a ton of shrinkage, but we do get some. So that relationship between how much shrinkage or the difference from wet to dry styling, which has a lot of variable factors, is also going to affect or be affected by how tight the coil pattern is. For example, loose curl patterns are going to have less shrinkage and tighter coil patterns are going to have more shrinkage. So let's go through, and I feel like it's a little heavy right in here. And when I'm looking, I'm deciding that this coil could use just a little bit of texture. Now, rather than going in and removing the full weight of the curl by C-cutting, I am just going to remove a little bit of hair from the interior of that coil. By doing this, I am going to remove weight. So you see, we're just taking a little bit, and just by doing that, we're going to get more elevation and more diffusion from the curl itself. I think something that I'm gonna go in, we're just gonna select some more coils as we move through here. I think one of the things that makes cutting curls so intimidating is the amount of varying advice that we get whenever we are trying to do curly cutting, right? There's a bunch of different ideas out there. I have heard in my hair journey, I have heard we can never ever dry cut curls, right? It's too much friction, it's gonna damage it. I have heard we can never ever wet cut curls. I have heard we can never use combs or brushes when dealing with curls, including color surfaces. And then I've heard, you can only use this kind of comb or brush, and you can only do it when it's wet. And all of these different advice and techniques and tips end up making the whole thing pretty convoluted if we don't understand the relationship to what each of those techniques does, why we would choose to do them, and what that end result is. Personally, I have tried a bunch of different things, all right? I've made all of the mistakes when it comes to textured hair services, and one of the things, well, I have found 3 things to mostly ring true. One of them, the first and foremost being, is it damaging the hair? Okay? And if the answer is no, I ask myself the next 2 questions. Do I like the results? And if the answer is yes, then the third question is, does my client like the results? And if it's not damaging the hair and everyone is happy, we've got ourselves the right answer. So again, I'm just coming in here and removing a little bit of weight. So here we have another coil, all right? And so I'm gonna come in, and on this second bend, I'm going to remove just a little additional weight from the interior of that bend. So I am not cutting this coil shorter. I am just removing a little bit of weight from that second bend to allow for more elevation, a little more expansion, and to round the shape of my fringe here. All right, so I'm gonna keep popping that up. I'm gonna keep reassessing, and I'm gonna choose to do this dry because it gives me the most control. And a lot of times when we're cutting fringe, even when it's not curls, this area has a lot of room for variable, right? We don't have an even hairline. A lot of times we find a lot of variations in hair growth patterns that affect that finished result. And a lot of your curly girls, if they're wearing their hair curly 100% of the time, they're not using much heat in their styling, which means what you see is what you get. So even though this is a very intuitive process for the result that we're looking for, and for this client's specific hair type and specific styling routine, this is going to give us the most control. All right, so what I'm gonna do, now that I'm pretty happy with how this looks, is I'm gonna take a little bit more of my Curl Therapy leave-in conditioner, and I'm just gonna apply a tiny bit. What I love about this conditioner is that it is lightweight, so I can use it dry without having to worry about it influencing or impacting too much this finished result. And it is not sticky, it is not flaky, so I do not have to worry about using it dry. It's going to help increase shine, minimize frizz. It's got mango butter, kapuasu butter, that are gonna help strengthen the cuticle layer, move through the sections more easily, and help fight dryness in that hair. So now that I've gone in and I've detailed just a little bit with that Curl Therapy, I'm gonna look, I'm gonna clean up just a couple of little hairs from the bottom of that perimeter using the exact same technique. Again, not coming in straight across because that is going to create expansion at the end of the coil. We want to create less volume towards the very ends of the coil so that we can trying to think of the word here. It's gone. We can taper the ends of the coil down so that we get more definition at the end of the coil, which is what is most visible when we're looking straight on at a hairstyle. Like when you're looking at my hair or her hair right now, what your eyes mostly pick up is where light reflects most, and that is at the ends of our coils, right? So if we're removing weight, we're tapering that down and we're creating a more detailed focal point for the eye to pick up definition, right? This is where we start to see variations in curl pattern the most because that's where our eye goes. So if you have any questions on her, you can go ahead and drop a comment. I'm still hoping that maybe I can see this on here. I don't think I'm gonna be able to. It's just not gonna happen for us today. But, so I'm gonna go ahead and set her to the side, and we're gonna come in and we're gonna talk about wet cutting. All right, so we have a different curl type here. This does not actually hold all of the bearing on whether or not we're going to wet or dry cut. I'm just gonna adjust here. Do I need to raise her?
No, just turn the face towards me a bit more this way.
All right.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right, sorry guys, my idea did not work. So, we're gonna be wet cutting. Now she already has a fringe. We're gonna be working in the interior and along the exterior here. So because she is a mannequin, she does not have much variation in curl pattern, but most heads of curls have a variation or a combination of different curl shapes as well as loose, medium, or tight curl types. On your mannequins, you're going to see much less differentiation, but we're gonna pretend that she does. Now, I'm gonna come through and saturate this section on this side, and we're gonna create the perimeter together by wet cutting. She's still reasonably wet, so this should be reasonably quick. The most important thing here is that I get even saturation. Now I have already prepped her with the Curl Therapy leave-in to save us some time. And I am just checking to make sure that we have even saturation from scalp to ends. If we do not have even saturation, and this is true of wet, damp, or dry cutting, if we don't have even saturation, we are going to lose some control for the finished result. So let's section out our perimeter here. Now, a lot of times you hear like, hey, everything south of the perimeter is stationary and everything north of the perimeter is where we get all of our movement. But that is not true when it comes to curls. Depending on how tight that curl type is, you can visually assess, do we start seeing rise in body and elevation before the parietal ridge? And most of the time we do, which means you still get movement below the parietal ridge. So if you're coming in and creating your entire foundation, only keeping that rule in mind, you end up having to come in and do more detail work than you originally planned on. So we're going to visually assess where we start to see elevation, and that is where I'm going to section this out to make sure that we get an even perimeter. Clip this out of the way for you, and then come here and resaturate. Now, for this curl type and for, sorry, I'm gonna move this just a little bit, and for for our end goal, I'm going to use a wide tooth comb because it is going to give me the least amount of tension so that as I am coming out, I can still visually see where differentiations in her hair are going to be, and I'm not forcing that hair to lay in places that it doesn't normally lay. So even though we are wet cutting and we're using a comb, we're still allowing for a little bit of intuitive approach to the process to get to our finished look. So starting in the back here, because we can visually see that she is a little bit longer, we're going to create our perimeter. Right? So coming through, is this still good?
Yeah.
Coming through, using minimal tension, and I'm not going to bring this section up against the nape, right? This is something that we are very used to doing because hair that does not have bends and curves in it tends to hug the nape. But hair that has bends and curves, and the tighter they are, the less they will hug the nape. So I'm going to comb all of this down, let it set a natural fall, expand all of these coils completely, and using minimal tension, come in and create that perimeter. Now, I'm gonna go ahead and let all of this expand out, and then I'm going to clean up just under the neckline. And I see just a few coils. And for this technique, we're using the tips of our shears because we are really concentrating on individual coils at the ends, and that's going to give me the most precision. Now, I have not cut any more around the hairline towards the face because we now have an even base that we're going to use. We're going to drop this top section and make sure that we don't have hair that is moving out of our perimeter when we make sure to comb it in natural fall. Again, not pushing the hair down to hug the nape of the neck because that is not how that hair lives. We're going to let this hair expand freely and then check our perimeter. Make sure we don't have any areas that we need to come in and remove more weight. And now her perimeter is done. For cutting into the interior, I want to show you guys something that I've developed that really, really cuts the guesswork out of creating holes in the perimeter for our curly mannequins. So this is what we're calling the 360 cut. And one of the issues that we have with curly cuts is that the variable factor is more than when we're cutting with straight hair. When we have variations around the hairline, we are dealing with less hair, which means we are dealing with less weight, and the opportunity for shrinkage increases. So if we allow ourselves to use the hairline as our perimeter guide, we can customize how much weight we remove or leave on the interior of the cut, making sure that we don't have gaps and steps as we move towards the front. So we've sectioned her out and using the hairline as our guide for each of these sections. So we have our nape section, we have our side section that comes from just behind the ear to where we start on this angle because this creates a variation in our perimeter guide, right? Our perimeter that actually sits on the actual perimeter of this haircut is very little hair compared to the perimeter that sits to create on this section above the ear. And as we move toward the hairline or towards the front of the hairline and the fringe. Now, these pie sections can be customized based on each client because no two hairlines are the same. Sometimes when I'm using this sectioning, I will have 3 additional pie sections. And sometimes when I'm using this sectioning, I'll have 3 less pie sections. But the first step is to create where we want the elevation or layers in our curly cut to start. So right up here at the center of our pie, I'm going to take a look at this one section and see where it lays. So if I'm wanting the rest of this to elevate and start our graduation here, I'm going to take this section and I'm going to create that guide. I'm going to look and see if the fall is where I want it. And if it is, we're going to let down this nape section, resaturate, and I'm going to connect the 2 guidelines. So this takes all of the guesswork out. Using the wide teeth of my comb again, I'm going to elevate. I'm going to show you guys. So here is my perimeter. This is my guide. Here is my interior guide. I'm going to come in and connect both of the 2 using loose tension. I'm going to wait for that guide to fall out. I'm going to watch this guide here. And then using just the tips of my shears, connect the 2. And now I know I'm not going to lose any of that length. Now, in situations where I have a variation in curl type and I have a tighter coil somewhere in the interior, I can choose to elevate more to compensate for that, so I leave more weight on top of that section and I don't end up with holes in the interior where we want to see graduation, because those holes bring the eye right to them. And a lot of times those holes exist because the variation in curl pattern wasn't taken into account in sectioning or in the angle and how much we're cutting off. Go ahead and move to this next section. Now, I do not need to take a guide from my previous section. Why? Because I have already cut the exterior of this cut, and I have already cut my interior guide up at the top of my pie. So the only sections that I need to bring to each of these sections as we move around is that interior guide. So let's go ahead and do this next section. And I've got that interior guide piece, and I've got my exterior guide piece, and I'm going to elevate and marry the two. I see that my exterior guide is starting to fall out. I see my interior guide that I'm keeping track of. I'm gonna come through, check. Now, I wanna show you, look at that beautiful graduation. How simple is that? It's almost foolproof, all right? We have point A and we have point B, and we have already taken into account all of the variables that get in our way as we're moving through curly cutting. Let's go ahead and do these next two sections so you guys can get a good look at how this cut will shape on one full side. While we're marrying these two sections, once again, I'm gonna check, make sure that my interior guide has moved with me, and pay attention to that exterior guide as it falls out, while keeping a sight line on that interior guide. And then move to our next section. Again, if you guys have questions, make sure that you drop them in the comments. I will be coming back in at least for the next 24 hours to answer any questions that you have. Or if you don't feel comfortable dropping the question publicly, you can always message me privately. On my Instagram is kentucky.curls, and you can come into my inbox there and we can talk about whatever you would like. So I want to show you guys the positioning here, because it is very easy to bring everything straight up. But what happens is that we're not actually paying attention to where the real guide is. This section here, our exterior guide is here. It is not all of this. It is just this section. So as we're bringing all of this up to marry from our interior guide, we need to make sure that we have combed this section with that in mind. Come in, marry those two. There we have it. I have left out her fringe section because we have already done a fringe. If we were going to continue through on our fringe, we would follow this same pattern unless we didn't want to see the same graduation from apex to exterior. Thank you guys so much